Hello, I'm Michele from the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine in the children's room. And today we are reading part 5 of The Water Horse by Dick King Smith, illustrated by David Parkins, and published by Crown Publishers in 1990. Let's get to part 5. Chapter 10, A Hairbrained Plan. Christmas 1932 was a good one in the small white house on the cliff top because for once, Father was at home for it. What's more, since his next voyage was to be a short one, he would have leave again, he told them, at the end of March or the beginning of April. And by then, the water horse will be 3 years old. Isn't that right, he said? They nodded. And heaven knows how much bigger he's going to grow, said Father. We must move him. We must move him then, this coming spring, or else he's likely to be too big to move at all. But how can we, Father? Asked Kirsty. By road, of course. What in? Well, what would you put a water horse in? A horse trailer, said Angus. Not big enough. A moving van, said Grumble. Difficult, said Father. Moving vans are quite high off the ground and it would be very hard to load him. You'd need a crane like we use at the docks. Anyway, what about the moving men? They'd be bound to see him and the story would be out. No, it seems to me there's only one kind of vehicle suitable for the job. A cattle truck, said Mother. Exactly, you've got it. They're just big enough. They're strong enough to carry about a dozen bulls. They're covered so they won't be seen on the journey, and they have a good long tail ramp to let down for him to scramble up. And one last thing. There's a wee door at the front of the body just behind the cab so that whoever goes into the truck before Crusoe to lure him in with food can get out without getting squashed. Just one thing you've forgotten, said Grumble. What about the driver of this cattle truck? There's no way of keeping things secret from him. There's no need, said Father. He knows already. The driver of the cattle truck will be me. One of his shipmates, Father went on to explain, had a brother who was a cattle hauler in the district and would, he felt sure, rent out one of his trucks. My pal tells me, said Father, that his brother is not the most honest man in Scotland. Now and again, apparently, one of his trucks might pick up a bunch of cattle from an outlying field on a dark night and put them down in a different field 40 or 50 miles away. Rustling, you mean, said Grumble. Father nodded. Mother looked worried. You mean, she said, that you're planning to let this hauler think you want his truck to go cattle rustling? Father grinned. A nod and a wink and a bit of extra cash in his hand should do the trick, he said. I have a clean driver's license, and though I've never driven a truck, I expect I'll soon get the hang of it. Mother opened her mouth to question such a crazy idea and then shut it again. Just as she had been pleased to see Crusoe's departure from the goldfish pond to the lock-in, so now she realized she was glad to think he would be going many miles away, out of their lives forever, perhaps. It was not that she bore the water horse any ill will, it was simply that for nearly 3 years now, he had occupied so much of everybody's time. Besides demanding, she told herself unfairly, constant supplies of sardines and herrings and chocolate chip cookies, her children, and she felt unfairly again, had neglected their homework, and her father had done less in the garden. Now her husband was proposing to remove the creature? Good. She said, with the look and tone of Grumble. I never heard of such a harebrained plan. I washed my hands of it, and she marched off to the kitchen to wash the dishes. But where are we going to take Crusoe? Asked Kirsty. It's got to be a really big lock, hasn't it? Asked Angus. You're right, Angus, said Father. Get the map out of the drawer, will you? It's the one marked West Scotland, Islay to Gairloch. And when Angus had gotten it, Father spread it out on the table. Now then, he said, first of all, we could always put him in a sea loch. We could also let him go there into Loch Moidart, and he'd be free to make his way anywhere in the world. No, no, the children cried. We'd never see him again. Then it's one of 3, isn't it? Said Grumble. There's Loch Morar. That's the nearest sizable one to us, and deep, very deep. Maybe the water horse that was said to live in it when I was a boy is still there. Might be company for him. Wait, though, said Father, looking at the map. See here? He could easily get down the River Morar to the sea. That's no good. Well, then what about Loch Lomond? That's big enough. Here's a picture of them looking at the map together. Too far, said Father. I don't want to have to drive all that way. That only leaves one then, said Grumble, and he pointed to a long blue stretch of water that ran diagonally up to the northeast, 24 miles from end to end, and maybe the deepest of them all. That's all the space he could want there. You're right, said Father. That's where we'll take Crusoe. That's the lock for him. And it's not as long as a drive as all that, say 30 miles to Fort William and another 30 to Fort Augustus. When he's living there, said Kirsty, will we be able to visit him sometimes? Her voice sounded a bit shaky. Of course we will, said Father. It's no distance, really. Make a nice outing in the summer. We'll go and we'll call him and he'll come for a tickle. But suppose other people catch sight of him. They could, I suppose, said Grumble, now and again, if he's absent-minded and forgetful and shows himself for a moment, or if he gets overexcited hunting fish near the surface, or if he bumps a boat like he did Posties. We must just hope he behaves himself. Even if folk catch a glimpse of him, they're never going to be certain what they're seeing, said Father. They'll think to themselves, oh, maybe it was just a log of wood, or shadows on the water, or salmon leaping, or otters playing, or a dead stag floating among the waves. They'll never be sure. We are the only people who will ever know for certain that in that loch there lives the water horse. Chapter 11, A Ride in a Truck. When the time came, loading Crusoe was easy. There was a rough track that led down to the loch and from the road, and Father had reversed the cattle truck along it, stopping just short of the water where the ground grew soggy. Of Crusoe there was naturally no sign since he had not been called. Now that spring morning, on April the 14th, 1933, everything was ready. The children sat safely inside the cab of the truck, while Father and Grumble stood by the end of the lowered tail ramp. Mother was staying at home, but she had provided a parting present for the water horse, a gift of food with which to lure him out of the kitchen, out of the lock-in, up the ramp, and into the body of the truck. There had been much discussion about what this lure should be: chocolate chip cookies, herring, or the very first food that had ever passed Crusoe's infant lips, sardines. Trouble is, said Father, that if I lay a trail of any of those, he's liable to find it difficult to pick them up off the ground. It'll slow him up, and maybe he won't make the effort. What we need is something tasty that I can drag along in front of him, just out of his reach. Something long enough to keep me clear of becoming an accidental meal myself. A string of sausages, said Mother. A wonderful idea, said Father. Now he paused a moment, looking and listening carefully, but he could see no one and hear nothing, so he walked to the brink and called, Crusoe! And Crusoe came surging in. Father and Grumble had feared that perhaps by now the water horse might be unwilling to leave the element in which, except for his move from the goldfish pond to Locken, he had lived for over 3 years. But their fears were unfounded. As Father walked slowly backward, trailing the string of sausages, Crusoe, with an action like that of a giant caterpillar, humped himself out of the water and over the intervening ground toward the cattle truck. And here's a picture. Up the slatted ramp he hauled himself, neck outstretched in his effort to catch the end of the long sausage string, and into the body of the truck while the springs creaked and groaned under his weight. Dropping the lure at the far end, Father nipped smartly out by the little side door and ran around to the back. Then, as Crusoe was wolfing down the sausages with grunts of contentment, Father and Grumble each took hold of one side of the tail ramp and heaved it up and screwed the locking clamps tight. The water horse was loaded. The journey itself was also uneventful. Southward they went at first to Glenfinnan, then due east along the north shore of Loch Isle till they came to Fort William. They stopped by the banks of Loch Lochy. Father was a little worried that the water horse might become uncomfortably dried out, so here, at about the halfway mark of the journey, he and Grumble filled buckets and sloshed the contents through the slits in the side of the cattle truck. Crusoe bellowed quietly in appreciation. By the side of Loch Oik, they stopped again and repeated the operation. Kirsty and Angus got out to stretch their legs, while Father and Grumble filled the buckets. Just as Father was about to toss in the last bucketful, they heard the noise of an approaching car. "Off the road, children," said Father, for the way was narrow, and they all stood and waited for the vehicle to round the bend ahead. Tourists, they thought, but it was a police car. They watched as it came closer, willing it to go by without stopping, but it slowed and drew to a halt. "Quickly," said Father to Grumble, "lift the hood." A lone police officer got out of the police car. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. "Yes, we are," thought Father, but "No, we're not," he said in a cheerful voice. "Just going to top off the radiator. There's maybe a wee bit of a leak somewhere. She needs a drop of water now and again." He started to unscrew the radiator cap gingerly as though it were hot and began to lift the bucket of water. Fortunately, the policeman did not closely watch Father's attempts to fill an already full radiator, but turned to Grumble. "Where are you bound?" he asked. "Fort Augustus," said Grumble truthfully. "A load of fat cattle for the slaughterhouse," he added untruthfully. "Your own stock?" asked the policeman. "Oh, aye," said Grumble, truthful once more. "There's a good bit of rustling goes on in these parts. Would you believe it?" said the policeman. "Never," said Grumble in an astonished voice. "It's a fact," said the policeman. He looked at the old man and the two small children. "Not that you're my idea of rustlers," he said, smiling, and then he put his eye to one of the slits in the side of the cattle truck. Mercifully, he could see very little, for Crusoe's bulk occupied all the available space, but he could just make out a great dark flank pressed against the truck's side. He poked it with a gloved finger, and Crusoe, thinking this to be a caress from his friends, gave a low bellow of pleasure. "A fine big beastie that one seems to be," said the policeman. He turned to Angus. "A good size, is it, laddie?" he asked. "A monster," said Angus solemnly. The policeman laughed and ruffled Angus's hair as Father now joined them, having completed his pantomime with the radiator. "Topped her off, have you?" said the policeman. "Yes. Better get that leak seen to." "Yes," said Father. "We must be getting along now." "And so must I," said the policeman. And greatly to their relief, he did. In the early afternoon, they reached Fort Augustus at the lower end of the great loch that they sought. A new road had recently been built along its northern shore, but Father chose the old southern road and drove steadily on, looking out all the while for a suitable place. Just short of Doris, he found it. There was a rest area on the left, perched high above a steep, bushy slope that fell directly into the loch. Here they stopped. Crusoe himself did not exactly enjoy his journey. At first, when the tail ramp slammed shut on him, it felt strange for him to be confined. He was not afraid, for he did not know the meaning of fear, but he did not much care for the roar of the engine and the stink of gas fumes and the bumping and swaying motion of their progress. He started to feel a little sick. After a while, however, he became used to things, and indeed, because it was the time of day when he always took a nap, he began to feel drowsy. He had almost dropped off when the bumping and swaying stopped and some water was splashed on him. "Nice giants," he thought to himself, and he gave a little bellow of thanks. Then it was onward again, inside this strange cave in which, because of his great size, he had hardly room to move a muscle. A little later, the bumping stopped again, more water was thrown in, and Crusoe lowed in appreciation as someone prodded his side. But how cramped he felt, and what a relief it was when at last the roaring and the jolting stopped for good, and the door behind him swung down and let in the light. Painfully, for his limbs were cramped, Crusoe maneuvered himself backward and down the slow slope of the ramp and to the ground. And how pleasant it was to have the old familiar tickling, for the two small giants had each found a stick and enthusiastically went to work on him. Then, as Crusoe squirmed pleasurably around, he suddenly saw beneath and stretching away in either direction as far as the eye could see, an enormous expanse of water. "Get into it," every instinct told him. "Get under it." And he heaved his huge body to the edge of the rest area and slithered over and crashed down through the bushes on the slope below and fell with a mighty splash into the sun-dappled depths of the loch. When he had gone, they all stood silently staring out over the still springtime waters. Father felt pleasure and pride that the problem had been solved in a seaman-like manner. Grumble felt relief that now at last the great beastie was in a safe place where he need worry about him no more. Kirsty was remembering the time when Crusoe was only as long as the span of Grumble's hand, 50 or 60 feet. Grumble had said he would grow to, and now she no longer doubted it. Angus was remembering that he had forgotten to bring any emergency supplies. For all of them, there was a sense of deep contentment that now the water horse had everything that he could want. Forevermore, he could have the freedom of this great, deep, fish-filled loch, safe from all dangers. He will be happy ever after, thought Kirsty, and because of that, so am I. Father looked at his watch. My, he said, will you look at the time? It's 5 to 3 already. We must be starting home or we'll be late for that high tea Mother is getting ready for us. Blow me down, said Angus, that would never do, and they clambered into the cattle truck and drove away. Down, 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 the water horse dived, scattering great schools of fish as he went, down into the cold black depths, and then turned and shot upward faster and faster, proud of his strength. For a moment, all his training was forgotten, all the giant's teaching that he must not show himself unless summoned. He burst out into the sunshine in the middle of the loch and plunged and rolled around on the surface. So happy was he to be in this wonderful new watery world. Then he came to his senses, and with a final great surge, he sank from sight. And here is a picture of him. Chapter 12, from a local newspaper. The first reported sighting of the monster. On April 14, 1933 at 3 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Michele of Drumnadrochit were driving along the new road on the northern shore of Loch Ness when they saw an enormous animal rolling and plunging until it disappeared with a great upsurge of water. And here is a picture of the Loch Ness monster, who we also know as Crusoe. Hope you enjoyed reading this book with me. It was The Water Horse by Dick King Smith, illustrated by David Parkins, and published by Crown Publishers. I am Michele from the Children's Room in the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and hope you'll join me with another time to read. Thanks. Bye.